Welcome to Policy Implications. In this podcast, we dive into new research in economics and finance and ask what it means for policymakers in the real world. This season, we focus on Ukraine, the war, the economy, and the institutions that will shape the country's future. I'm your host, Olha Zadorozhna, an economist working on Ukraine and Ukrainian myself. This series is supported by the Economists for Ukraine Network and Kozminski University. Today's episode tackles one of the most debated policy tools used against Russia: sanctions on its oil sector. Russia's oil and gas revenues finance a substantial share of the federal budget and, crucially, the war effort. Yet many observers point out that Russian oil production has not collapsed yet. So the question remains whether sanctions are failing, or are we looking at the wrong metrics? So my guest today is Erik Katovich, an economist at the University of Connecticut and author of the paper Measuring the Dynamic Impact of Sanctions on Russian Oil Companies. Erik's research uses detailed field-level data covering thousands of Russian oil and gas fields, and instead of looking only at aggregate exports or prices, he studies how firms adjust production, exploration, and investment decisions over time. Erik, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to join you.
Well, to give our listeners a bit more context, after Russia's 2014 invasion of Ukraine and annexation of Crimea, the US and EU imposed sanctions targeting major oil companies. These sanctions focused on financial restrictions and bans on advanced technologies, and in particular, they targeted offshore and complex fields. Importantly, the goal was not necessarily to reduce current Russian production immediately, but to undermine Russia's long-term energy capacity. And before asking about specific results of your paper, Erik, let me start with the big picture. There is a common narrative that sanctions either work or don't work based on whether oil output falls right away or not. And your paper takes a very different perspective, a dynamic one. So, Erik, what was the central question you wanted to answer in this research, and why is it important to think dynamically about sanctions?
Thank you. So the question originally came from observing that a lot of the research, a lot of the discussion that happens around sanctions often focuses at the country level. So we talk about, for example, Russia getting sanctioned. But in practice, sanctions most often target entities within a country. So for example, entities could be individuals, addresses, or in many cases, firms. And in particular, a lot of sanctions target oil companies because they're really critical parts of oil-dependent economies like Russia's, and they finance a large part of Russia's government budget. So sanctions have targeted, starting after 2014, and then even more so after 2022, sanctions have targeted some major Russian oil companies, including large state-owned companies like Rosneft and Gazprom, and a few others, but have left a lot of other Russian oil companies completely, are relatively untouched, right? And so within Russia, there's been some companies that have been affected and others that have not by these sanctions. When we think about targeting large, sophisticated, complex companies, like some of these are, we have to think that these companies have many margins along which they can adjust or adapt to sanctions. And understanding how they adapt is super important in terms of if you want to maximize the impact of your sanctions and minimize the chances of unintended or undesirable consequences. It could be the case that sanctions impose large damages. That's often the goal, reducing revenues, reducing productive capacity, but it could also lead them to form new partnerships with adversary countries or adapt in ways that increase technological innovation and leave them, a better company than they were before. So there is potential for unintended consequences. And in particular, there's potential for companies to adapt over periods of time, right? So what you see as the immediate response to sanctions might be quite different from what you see emerging over longer term exposure to sanctions. So my goal with this project was to look not just at country level impacts of sanctioned policies where the discussion often focuses, but to zoom in on the companies that are targeted by these policies and try to understand how they adapted, both across their very large portfolios of oil and gas fields and also across time. So, in the short term, what was their immediate reaction, and what are the longer term impacts of exposure to the policies?
So very good that you mentioned these short-term versus long-term effects, because that was my next question, actually. So one of your most striking findings is that production in sanctioned fields actually increased in the short term after 2014, when the first sanctions were introduced. And at the first glance, this sounds like sanctions backfiring. They are not working, basically. So could you please explain why sanctioned firms would increase production after being targeted, and what economic logic drives this short-term response?
Exactly. So if you look at, again, like I said, country level measures after sanctions are imposed in 2014, Russian oil production does not collapse. And amongst these sanctioned fields, it actually increases relative to the non-sanctioned oil fields within Russia. So this seems to be a sort of a paradoxical finding and is one of these potentially unintended consequences that sanctions can have if we don't think about how companies are making their decisions. So in the oil industry, companies are always choosing how much to produce in the current period, and also looking to the future, choosing how much to explore and develop oil fields, which is going to let them produce in future periods, right? So because oil is a depletable resource, as you extract from a reserve, that reserve goes down, and you need to constantly reinvest in exploration and development of new fields to keep future production going. So the mechanism, I think, in the model that I develop in the paper, which explains this short-term increase in production, is that companies become basically more short-termist, or they start to devalue the future more. So this is driven mostly by a loss of access to financing, which means that their borrowing costs go up, and therefore their discount rates looking at the future go up as well. And so basically they start to value less sort of that long-term future perspective and focus more on immediate gains. And so these companies basically, they reduce exploration investment and development of new fields, which doesn't pay off in the current period, but would pay off in the future. So they cut back on that stuff, and they really focus their effort on ramping up production in the short term. Right, so they start to draw down their inventories or their reserves in existing developed oil fields, and that explains this short-term increase in production. So again, one of the immediate impacts of the 2014 sanctions was to, in the short term, increase revenues available to the Russian government, because the oil companies, which provide government, revenues, increase their production. But it's largely because if you look over this longer period, they are having difficulties developing new fields because they can't obtain financing to fund that future development, and they can't obtain the advanced exploration technologies they needed to develop especially their most advanced fields. So in 2014, Russian oil companies were starting to expand into some more challenging environments than they traditionally had operated in, including offshore and Arctic fields, and starting to get involved in fracking, which was new technologies that were being almost entirely imported from Western countries. So they were starting to expand into these more challenging fields, which required, again, financing and technology that sanctions cut off access to. And so they cut back on that future-focused investment, and they refocused their efforts on current production.
Interesting. So your results also show accelerated reserve depletion and increased field abandonment, along with the concentration of the attention more on the production. So firms are pumping more at the time, right? And they're investing less in their future. So how large are these long-run effects in quantitative terms? Do you have an estimate? And what does this mean for Russia's government revenues over, say, 10 or 20-year horizon?
Yeah. So in the model that I developed, which is trying to project out these impacts of the 2014 sanctions into the future, I calculate from my model that the 2014 sanctions imposed significant long-term costs on Russian oil and gas production. So, like I said, in the very short term, for several years after 2014, production actually went up, and therefore revenues for these companies and tax payments to the Russian government also went up. But this was a short-term phenomenon. So, over the long term, over say a 20-year horizon, existing reserves start to get depleted, and you start to face the consequences of cutting back on the exploration and development of new fields that we see happening after 2014. So over, say, a 20-year horizon, my model predicts that exploration, let me see. So over a 20-year horizon, my model predicts that government revenues would fall by a cumulative 6.5%. Oil and gas revenues would fall by 6.5%, which is about $40 billion in current values, and that the average Russian oil field would be abandoned approximately 11 years earlier. So this abandonment result is driven by the fact that companies face these new constraints on borrowing money and getting technologies to develop new fields. And so they effectively abandoned fields that they previously would have developed. So fields sort of at the margin that before they were making an effort to develop, for example, Arctic offshore fields, technologically challenging, high cost fields. They require large upfront investments over long time periods. And this is where that lack of access to financing, increased borrowing costs, and reduced access to technologies really bites for these companies. These fields they would have developed before, they abandon. And so as a result, so you see this increased rates of field abandonment and these relatively large effects over a 20-year horizon. Now, actually calculating these effects using just the data without a model becomes challenging because in 2022, a bunch of extra things hit the Russian oil sector, right? So starting in 2014, there were like very clear effects on this defined set of companies, right? There were these technology and financing sanctions. In 2022, the scenario gets a lot messier from a research perspective, right? So you start to see sanctions on Russia that affect the whole industry. So lack of access to payment systems, sort of generalized bans on Russian oil outputs. So you see like a EU oil embargo, you see a price cap on Russian oil exports. You also start to see some direct economic impacts of the war in Ukraine. So you see labor market, challenging labor market conditions for Russian companies. You see direct impacts of Ukrainian drone strikes on Russian oil infrastructure. So there's a bunch of things that happen after 2022 that make it a bit harder as a researcher to really isolate sanction impacts. So I think the model starting from 2014, one of the goals is to try to isolate and pick apart what are these different mechanisms driving results.
And yeah, this is very important part of your paper, distinguishing between different sanctions mechanisms like technology bans or financial restrictions or multinational participation limits. And according to your results, which of these mechanisms turns out to be the most powerful in hurting Russia's long-term oil capacity, and why?
So I focus in the paper on two primary mechanisms that were implemented in 2014. The first is banning access to advanced oil field technologies, particularly for exploration of new fields, and also banning access to Western financing. So both of these, of course, are things that Russian companies can, like I said, adapt to and try to evade, right? So they can try to develop, Russian companies can try to develop oil field exploration technologies domestically, though that has not gone very well for them. They can also try to find substitutes from non-sanction compliant countries like China, though for particular niches of the oil production process, they've found it very difficult to do this. So a lot of these niches were filled by particular Western components or technologies that were difficult to replace, at least in the short to medium term. For financing, of course, they can also turn to alternative lenders like the Russian government. So some of these are state-owned oil companies. Their sort of financing relationship with the government is opaque, but they can also look for international lenders in places like India or China. But there's previous research suggesting that when they go to, for example, look for alternative financing in places like India or China, they face higher borrowing costs. So those lenders understand that they have bargaining power in that relationship, and they're going to sort of squeeze those Russian companies more. So in any case, they face these additional challenges. And it seems like from my research that the financing sanctions have the largest impact. So basically banning access to borrowing from Western institutions has the largest impact in distorting the decision making and the production of these Russian oil companies. So, in particular, it's those financing bans that drive this intertemporal shift towards basically producing more now and investing less in that future production capacity. So that distortion is really driven by that loss of access to financing. The technology bans affect companies at the decision point of do we develop or explore these additional new fields or not. And so that has less short-term impacts because, like I said, that's not affecting the current production level. It's affecting how much reserves do you unlock for future production. And so that loss of sort of the technology ban has these slow burning effects that manifest over a longer period of time.
Right. And another piece of the puzzle that I would like to discuss with you is the multinational companies, because initially they remained in Russia in many joint ventures, even after 2014, after the illegal annexation of Crimea, and only after 2022, after the full-scale invasion, that we see a much larger exits. So based on your analysis, how important was the continued multinational participation? And did it significantly soften the impact of sanctions?
So this is a really interesting part of the story. In 2014, some of the sanction restrictions that were put in place made it difficult to form new multinational partnerships with sanctioned Russian companies, but they allowed existing partnerships to remain active. And so this included some direct participation of Western oil companies, which owned shares of sanctioned Russian fields. So, for example, BP had sort of unfortunate timing for them and entered a major corporate deal with Rosneft sort of in 2013, immediately before sanctions were put in place, and acquired almost a 20% stake in all of those oil fields. And they didn't exit after 2014. Another major part of this story was oil field service providers. This is companies like Halliburton, which have a lot of expertise in developing and offshore and operating oil fields. A lot of those companies remained in Russia, operating inside those sanctioned oil fields. So if, in that situation, you could imagine that having this partnership with a Western company could facilitate access to the financing or definitely to the technology and knowledge part of the picture, right? So these companies in remaining in these fields can give their expertise and provide their technologies, which could reduce the impact of sanctions in those fields. As a researcher, it's a little challenging to pick apart what would have happened without these companies because they did mostly stay in place until 2022. And so you don't see a lot of variation. And if you do, it's hard to say whether they left for a reason that we can attribute to the sanctions or not. Using my model, I find that the persistence of these multinational companies in sanctioned fields had a moderate impact on the field's outcomes. And so if they had left, the production would have fallen maybe by a few percent more, and Russian government revenues would have fallen by a small amount more. But there would have been a large negative impact on those multinational companies. So if they had left, they would have had to write off large equity stakes in Russian oil fields and sort of abandon a lot of their assets and lose out on those foregone revenues that they wouldn't be gaining after they leave those fields. So that's an example that people talk about called friendly fire, right? So in imposing sanctions, you can, of course, cause damage to the target, which in this case is Russian oil companies, but you can also cause friendly fire damage to firms from your own country. And so presumably there was debate and discussion starting in 2014 of whether sanctions should be strengthened and force these companies to exit from Russian fields. And I think the way that debate shook out was that it didn't happen. That restriction was not imposed until 2022, when you see sort of the mass exit of multinational companies from Russian fields. So BP at that point writes off about a $25 billion loss, and they leave, abandoning their Russian assets. as do ExxonMobil and several other companies, which included sort of stepping back from multi-billion-dollar investments that they had made in Russia. So at that point, in 2022, you see a much larger impact. Though, like I said, it's hard to pick apart causally what was that impact exactly, because in 2022, you also see all these other changes happening in the Russian oil sector.
Yes, indeed. And since 2022, sanctions expanded to include also the price caps and embargoes on
Exactly.
Russian oil exports. And at the same time, Russia developed alternative trade routes and also the so-called shadow fleet. And based on your findings, are upstream technology and financial sanctions more effective than, let's say, output-based tools like, for example, price caps? And how we should compare these two approaches? Are they very different?
I think that one of the main distinctions between the input sanctions, which I'm discussing, so you could sort of collectively call them input sanctions, things targeting inputs into the oil production process, like technology and financing, um, are quite distinct in their impacts from output sanctions. This is things that we see a lot of discussion about after 2022. For example, like you mentioned, the price cap on Russian oil exports. Um, I think the easiest way to think about it is that, based on what I find in my paper, is that input sanctions have this slow burning long term effect. So they don't cripple current Russian oil production when they're imposed. And like I said, they could even induce increases in Russian oil production in the short term. But by cutting back on investments, forcing these cuts to investment in the long term productive capacity of Russian companies, which again, oil fields have to be constantly reinvested and developed to guarantee the future of the oil company. The input sanctions target this long-term future viability of the Russian oil companies. In contrast, the output sanctions, which have been imposed after 2022, like the price cap, really effectively target current oil revenues. So I think that one sort of takeaway I have from these two distinct approaches to sanctioning companies is that a combination of the two would probably be the most effective approach. So price caps, again, or like a oil embargo or something like that, really hit those current revenues, denying access to the revenues from current Russian oil production. However, they don't necessarily affect a Russian company's sort of future prospects. They do only insofar as the company expects those policies to continue and therefore reduces their future investments. But the input sanctions effectively target and make it much more difficult for companies to develop those future fields. So input sanctions have this longer term effect. The output sanctions have this short term effect by hitting revenues directly.
And let me end with a broader question. So there is always political pressure for sanctions to deliver immediate, visible results. But your papers suggest that real effects may unfold slowly and quietly over the long period of time. So if you had to give one key lesson to policymakers designing sanctions today, what would it be?
So when considering sanctions on large, complex firms like Gazprom, Rosneft, and these large oil companies, we have to remember that these companies have many margins of adaptation, right? They can adapt over time. They can adapt across all of their thousands of fields, across their corporate partnerships with other countries, with investors from different places. And so because of this, the impacts are complex and sometimes difficult to measure or to assess. Are these having an effect or not? In particular, for the types of sanctions that were imposed on Russian oil companies starting in 2014, denying them access to technology and financing, these had large measurable effects on reducing the long-term productive capacity of these companies. In that sense, the policy imposed in 2014 was very successful and has been very successful along the stated policy goals, which again in 2014 were not to cripple current production, but to reduce that long-term productive capacity of the companies. They have been very successful in that sense. But I think an important consideration is thinking about alignment between the impacts of the policy and the political goals of the policy, right? So if the goal of a sanction is deterrence in the sense of getting, for example, Russian leadership to, uh, you know, which it could have been before 2022, to avoid entering a war because of expected damages from sanctions, or to end a war because of the increasing costs that these sanctions are imposing. If that's the goal, is to change political decision making through the policy, then we have to think, what are the impacts of a policy that causes effects only 5, 10, 15, or 20 years in the future, right? So we think that Russian government leadership and decision makers in Russia have their own time horizons, right? And may also discount the future, just like these oil companies do. So as sanctions and conflict and the uncertainty caused by the war in Ukraine may make Russian leaders less likely to care about what's happening 20 years from now, right? And so might not necessarily care about the viability of their oil companies 20 years in the future when all of these cuts to exploration and development of new fields start to bite. And so in that sense, the input sanctions alone, like the ones imposed after 2014, like I said, are very successful by the stated goals of the policy, but don't necessarily create that short-term pain that might lead sort of the Russian leadership to change their decisions about the war in Ukraine.
Right. Well, Erik, thank you very much for this conversation. Thank you for sharing your expertise and for being here with us and explaining these complex concepts. It was great, and I hope listeners enjoyed our talk as much as I did. This has been Policy Implications. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and stay tuned for more conversations on Ukraine's economy, institutions, and the challenges of reconstruction. I also encourage you to donate to support Ukraine. You'll find information on trusted ways to do so in the episode description.